"Play if you can," the billionaire mocked the waiter. But when the piano roared, he was left speechless. Today, you're about to witness a story that will remind you that talent doesn't wear expensive suits, dreams don't always come with trust funds, and sometimes the most extraordinary abilities are hidden in the most ordinary places. If you're ready for this incredible journey that will challenge everything you think you know about worth, talent, and the masks we all wear, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories, and activate those notifications. Let's dive into this extraordinary tale that unfolded in the heart of New York City. The crystal chandeliers cast warm, golden light across the marble floors of Le Bernardin's private dining room, where Manhattan's elite had gathered for the annual charity gala, hosted by tech mogul Richard Blackstone. The event was one of the most exclusive social gatherings of the year, with tickets costing $50,000 per person and a guest list that read like a who's who of American wealth and influence. Politicians, celebrities, tech entrepreneurs, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, and old money aristocrats mingled beneath 18-foot ceilings adorned with original Renaissance artwork, their conversations punctuated by the gentle tinkling of champagne glasses and the soft murmur of deals being negotiated between the appetizer course and dessert. The dining room itself was a masterpiece of sophisticated luxury, featuring hand-carved mahogany paneling imported from European palaces, Persian rugs worth more than most people's houses, and table settings that included Baccarat crystal, Hermes china, and sterling silver flatware crafted by master artisans. Fresh orchids, flown in from Thailand, adorned every table, while servers in pristine white uniforms moved through the space with choreographed precision, ensuring that every detail of the evening maintained the standard of perfection expected by guests who were accustomed to having their every desire anticipated and fulfilled. Richard Blackstone moved through the crowd with the confident ease of someone who had spent the last 15 years building a technology empire that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in American history. At 38, he possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and ruthless focus that had allowed him to identify market opportunities that others missed and capitalize on them before his competitors even recognized they existed. His company, Quantum Dynamics, had revolutionized cloud computing infrastructure and artificial intelligence applications, generating annual revenues that exceeded $30 billion and employing over 80,000 people across 6 continents. Richard's personal fortune was estimated at $12 billion by Forbes magazine, making him the 15th wealthiest person in America and among the 50 richest individuals in the world. His success story was the kind that business schools used as case studies. A middle-class kid from Ohio who had dropped out of Stanford to start a company in his garage and had built it into one of the most valuable technology corporations in history through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking, tireless work ethic, and an almost supernatural ability to predict technological trends before they became obvious to mainstream markets. But Richard's meteoric rise to wealth and power had come at a cost that went far beyond the 18-hour workdays and constant pressure of managing a global corporation. In his relentless pursuit of financial dominance and market leadership, he had developed a worldview that divided humanity into 2 distinct categories: people who mattered because they had achieved wealth, power, and influence, and people who were essentially invisible because they served the needs of those who had achieved greatness. Richard had gradually lost the ability to see service workers, restaurant staff, household employees, drivers, security guards, or anyone else whose job involved supporting his lifestyle as fully realized human beings with their own dreams, talents, stories, and aspirations. This systematic dehumanization hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process that began with Richard's first major business successes, when he had started to believe that his financial achievements were proof of his superior intelligence, work ethic, and natural abilities. As his wealth had grown, so had his conviction that people who hadn't achieved similar success were fundamentally different from him, less intelligent, less motivated, less deserving of respect and consideration. The evening's gala was being held to raise funds for arts education in public schools, a cause Richard supported not out of genuine passion for music, theatre, or visual arts, but because his philanthropic activities enhanced his public image and provided valuable networking opportunities with other wealthy donors. The tax benefits didn't hurt either, and Richard's accountants had structured his charitable giving to maximize both his deductible contributions and the positive publicity generated by his apparent generosity. Richard had pledged $10 million to the Arts Education Initiative, an amount that represented less than what his investment portfolio earned in interest during an average week, but which would generate headlines and photo opportunities that reinforced his reputation as a socially conscious leader who used his wealth to benefit society. The pledge would also provide him with naming rights to several new music programs and performance spaces, ensuring that his contribution would be permanently memorialized in ways that enhanced his legacy. The restaurant staff moved through the dining room with practiced invisibility, refilling wine glasses with vintages that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, clearing plates between the 7-course tasting menu designed by a James Beard award-winning chef, and ensuring that every detail of the evening proceeded flawlessly. The service team had been briefed extensively about the preferences and requirements of the evening's distinguished guests, with detailed notes about dietary restrictions, seating preferences, conversation topics to avoid, and the subtle protocols that governed interactions with people whose time was literally worth thousands of dollars per hour. Richard barely noticed the staff's presence, viewing them as functional components of the event's machinery rather than as individuals worthy of acknowledgement or consideration. To him, they were human furniture, necessary for the evening's success, but no more deserving of personal attention than the chairs they arranged or the flowers they positioned. When a young waiter accidentally brushed against Richard's shoulder while reaching across the table to clear a dessert plate during the transition between courses, Richard's response was sharp and immediate, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that had become second nature to him during his years of increasing wealth and isolation from ordinary human experience. "Watch where you're going," Richard snapped, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he typically reserved for addressing employees who had failed to meet his exacting standards. "This jacket costs more than you make in a month. Actually, probably more than you make in 3 months. The waiter, a young man who appeared to be in his mid-20s with dark hair, intelligent eyes, and the kind of quiet dignity that suggested he was accustomed to handling difficult situations with grace, paused in his work to offer a respectful apology. "I'm very sorry, sir. It won't happen again." Richard studied the young man with the dismissive attention he might give to a malfunctioning piece of equipment that had briefly disrupted his evening's enjoyment. The waiter was well-groomed and professional in his appearance, with posture that suggested good breeding despite his obvious economic circumstances. His uniform was pressed and immaculate, but Richard's experienced eye could tell that it was rental quality rather than custom-tailored. The young man's hands, Richard noticed, showed calluses that came from physical labor, and his watch was a simple, inexpensive model rather than the kind of luxury timepiece that Richard and his peers wore as symbols of their success and social status. Everything about the waiter screamed working-class background and limited opportunities, exactly the kind of person Richard had learned to overlook in his daily interactions with the world. Here was someone who would probably never own property, never travel first class, never have the resources to invest in the kind of educational and social opportunities that created real success. Someone whose entire existence revolved around serving people who had achieved the kind of greatness that separated the truly successful from the masses of ordinary humanity. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting that the question was more of a challenge than a genuine inquiry about the waiter's identity. "Marcus, sir. Marcus Chen." Richard nodded as if filing away information he would never need to access again, but which might prove useful if he needed to file a complaint with the restaurant's management about substandard service. "Well, Marcus, let me give you some advice about working in establishments like this one. The people you're serving tonight aren't just wealthy. We're people who have achieved things you couldn't possibly understand or appreciate." Richard gestured around the dining room, where conversations were taking place that involved billions of dollars in potential business deals, political strategies that would affect millions of people, and cultural initiatives that would shape American society for generations to come. "We've built companies that employ hundreds of thousands of people," Richard continued, his voice loud enough to be overheard by guests at nearby tables who were beginning to pay attention to this unusual interaction between the evening's host and a member of the service staff. "We've created technologies that have revolutionized entire industries. We've made investments that have funded breakthrough medical research, environmental initiatives, and educational programs that benefit society in ways you probably can't even comprehend." Marcus nodded politely, his expression remaining professionally neutral, despite what Richard assumed was probably resentment, envy, or perhaps simple confusion at being lectured by someone whose achievements were so far beyond his experience and understanding. "We deserve a level of respect and attention to detail that reflects our accomplishments and our contributions to society," Richard said, warming to his theme as he noticed that several nearby guests were listening to his impromptu lesson about social hierarchies and appropriate behavior in elite settings. "When you're working in environments like this, you need to understand that every person you're serving has achieved more in a single year than most people achieve in their entire lifetimes." Marcus continued to nod respectfully, accepting Richard's lecture with the kind of practiced patience that suggested he had probably encountered similar situations before and had learned to handle them without creating scenes that might jeopardize his employment. The conversation might have ended there, forgotten by Richard within minutes, as his attention returned to more important matters like the technology acquisition he was negotiating with a Japanese conglomerate and the political fundraiser he was planning for next month. But the evening's program included live entertainment that would create an unexpected opportunity for Richard to demonstrate his assumptions about talent, worth, natural abilities, and the fundamental differences between people who had achieved greatness and people who are destined to serve those achievements. The gala's organizers had arranged for a performance by Vladimir Petrov, a world-renowned Russian classical pianist who commanded fees of $75,000 for private performances, and whose recordings had won 3 Grammy Awards. Petrov was considered one of the finest living interpreters of Romantic-era compositions, and his presence at the evening's entertainment program had been a major selling point for attracting guests who expected world-class cultural experiences to accompany their charitable giving. But as the dessert course concluded and guests began settling into their seats for the musical portion of the evening, the event coordinator approached Richard with obvious distress, written across her usually composed features. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic as she leaned in to speak privately with the evening's host, "we have a serious problem with tonight's entertainment program. Vladimir Petrov has been hospitalized with severe food poisoning from something he ate earlier today. He's completely unable to perform tonight, and his doctor has advised that he shouldn't even attempt to travel." Richard felt a flash of irritation at this disruption to his carefully planned and extensively publicized evening. The entertainment program had been featured prominently in the promotional materials for the gala, and many guests had specifically mentioned their excitement about hearing Petrov perform. The absence of the promised musical entertainment would reflect poorly on Richard's organizational abilities and attention to detail, something he couldn't afford in a social circle where reputation for excellence was everything, and any sign of sloppiness or poor planning could damage relationships that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars in potential business opportunities. "What about backup arrangements?" Richard asked, his voice carrying the impatience he felt toward people who brought him problems without having already developed comprehensive solutions. "Surely you have contingency plans for situations like this. Professional event planners are supposed to anticipate potential problems and have alternatives ready." The coordinator shook her head apologetically, clearly aware that her answer would not satisfy Richard's expectations for professional competence. "This is such short notice, sir. We've contacted every professional musician in the New York area who could handle this kind of high-level performance, but everyone who has the necessary skills is either already booked for other engagements tonight or unable to travel here within the next hour." Richard looked around the dining room, where 200 of the most influential people in New York were expecting to be entertained by world-class musical performance as part of an evening they had paid handsomely to attend. These were people who were accustomed to having their expectations not just met, but exceeded. People who judged social events by their ability to provide experiences that couldn't be purchased or accessed through ordinary means. The absence of the planned entertainment would be seen as a failure of planning and execution, something that could undermine Richard's reputation as someone who delivered on his promises and maintained the highest standards in everything he organized. In social circles where perception often mattered more than reality, this kind of visible failure could have consequences that extended far beyond a single disappointing evening. "There has to be someone," Richard said, his voice carrying the impatience and frustration he felt toward people who brought him problems without having exhausted every possible solution. "What about the restaurant's regular musical entertainment? Don't establishments like this usually have house musicians, or at least connections with local performers who could step in during emergencies?" The coordinator gestured toward a magnificent Steinway Model D concert grand piano positioned in the corner of the dining room, an instrument that probably cost more than most people's houses, but which would remain silent unless someone with sufficient skill and artistry could be found to unlock its musical potential. "They do have this beautiful piano, sir," she replied, "and they occasionally feature live music during regular dinner service, but their usual pianist only works weekends, and we haven't been able to reach him. We've also tried contacting several music schools and conservatories, but it's impossible to arrange for a qualified performer to get here on such short notice." Richard walked over to examine the piano more closely, running his hand along the polished ebony surface of an instrument that represented the pinnacle of piano manufacturing craftsmanship. The Steinway Model D was the gold standard for concert performance, the same model used in the world's most prestigious concert halls and recording studios. It was an instrument worthy of the world's greatest pianists, but it required someone with extraordinary skill and training to reveal its full musical potential. The irony of having a room full of wealthy patrons, a world-class instrument, and no one capable of bringing them together in musical performance was not lost on Richard. Here was a perfect metaphor for the way he viewed the world: superior resources and sophisticated audiences waiting for someone with the rare combination of talent and training necessary to create something truly exceptional. As Richard stood beside the piano, considering his limited options and growing increasingly frustrated with the incompetence of his event planning team, he noticed Marcus Chen clearing tables nearby. The young waiter was moving, with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to work quickly and unobtrusively in high-pressure environments, stacking dishes and collecting glassware while navigating around guests who barely acknowledged his presence. An idea began forming in Richard's mind, an opportunity to salvage some entertainment value from the evening's disappointment while simultaneously demonstrating the natural limitations that separated people like himself from people like Marcus. It would be a perfect illustration of the social hierarchies and natural abilities that Richard believed governed human society. A chance to show his sophisticated guests what happened when someone without proper breeding, education, and natural talent attempted to operate in environments that required genuine excellence. "Marcus!" Richard called out, his voice carrying across the dining room with enough authority to capture the attention of nearby guests who were curious about why the evening's host was addressing one of the service staff in such a public manner. Marcus approached with the respectful attention of someone accustomed to responding immediately to customers' requests, regardless of how inconvenient, unusual, or potentially humiliating they might be. His expression was alert and professional, showing no sign that he anticipated anything other than a routine service request. "Yes, sir?" Richard smiled, the kind of condescending expression he used when he was about to make a point that he found particularly clever, or when he was preparing to demonstrate his superior understanding of human nature and social dynamics to an audience that would appreciate his insight. "I have a challenge for you, Marcus. Do you see this piano?" Richard gestured toward the Steinway with the theatrical flair of someone who understood that he was creating a moment of entertainment for his guests, even if it wasn't the sophisticated musical performance they had originally been promised. Marcus glanced at the magnificent instrument, then returned his attention to Richard with an expression that suggested he was trying to anticipate where this interaction might be leading and how he could navigate it successfully without creating problems for himself or the restaurant that employed him. "Yes, sir." Richard's smile broadened as he prepared to deliver the challenge that would provide his guests with an amusing demonstration of the natural order of things, while also creating a teaching moment about the differences between people who were born for greatness and people who were destined to serve those who achieved it. "Our scheduled pianist has fallen ill, and my guests are expecting entertainment as part of tonight's program," Richard announced, his voice loud enough to be heard by guests at several nearby tables who were beginning to turn their attention toward this unexpected interaction. "I'm willing to bet that someone like you, someone from your background, with your limited educational opportunities, has probably never had the chance to learn to play a sophisticated instrument like this one." The dining room had begun to quiet, as more guests became aware of the unusual scene developing between the billionaire technology mogul and the young waiter. Conversations at nearby tables trailed off as people turned to watch what was clearly building towards some kind of public demonstration or challenge. Richard was enjoying the attention and the opportunity to create an impromptu lesson about talent, breeding, and natural abilities. "Play if you can," he continued, his tone making it absolutely clear that he expected Marcus to be completely unable to accept this challenge successfully. "If you can manage to play something, anything at all, on this piano that actually sounds like music rather than just random noise, I'll give you $1,000 tip." And the challenge was delivered with the confident air of someone making a bet he was certain to win, and several guests chuckled appreciatively at Richard's clever way of turning the evening's entertainment crisis into an amusing demonstration of social hierarchies and natural limitations. Marcus stood beside the piano, his expression unreadable as he processed Richard's offer and the implications of the very public challenge he was being presented with in front of 200 of New York's most influential people. "And if I can't play?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the dining room, but carrying clearly enough for Richard and the nearby guests to hear. Richard's smile broadened into something approaching a smirk as he prepared to deliver the punchline that would complete his demonstration of how the world really worked. Then you'll have provided my guests with an excellent demonstration of why some people are naturally destined for greatness while others are destined to serve those who achieve it. You'll have shown everyone here the difference between people who are born with talent and opportunities and people who aren't. The cruelty of the challenge was unmistakable and intentional. Richard was essentially inviting Marcus to humiliate himself in front of 200 wealthy strangers, creating a public spectacle that would reinforce Richard's assumptions about natural hierarchies, while entertaining his guests with the discomfort and inevitable failure of someone who clearly didn't belong in their sophisticated social circle. The setup was perfect from Richard's perspective. Marcus would either decline the challenge, demonstrating the natural deference that people from his social class showed toward their betters, or he would attempt to play and fail miserably, providing concrete proof of the natural limitations that separated successful people from service workers. Either outcome would validate Richard's worldview and provide his guests with an amusing story to share at future social gatherings. Marcus looked around the dining room, taking in the faces of guests who were watching this interaction with the kind of fascination people typically reserved for witnessing someone else's potential public embarrassment. He could see the anticipation in their expressions, the expectation that they were about to witness either a humiliating refusal or an even more humiliating failure. The smart move would have been to decline the challenge gracefully, to make some polite excuse about not having musical training and return to his work serving tables and clearing dishes. That would have allowed him to maintain his dignity while avoiding the risk of public humiliation that Richard was offering him. Instead, Marcus walked over to the piano bench with a measured stride that suggested neither eagerness nor reluctance, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys with a familiarity that made Richard's confident smirk falter slightly. There was something in Marcus's posture and the way he positioned his hands that suggested this wasn't the first time he had approached a piano with serious intent. "Any particular requests?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that hadn't been present during their earlier interactions about service standards and appropriate behavior around wealthy patrons. Richard, still convinced that he was about to witness confirmation of his beliefs about natural hierarchies and the distribution of talent in human society, gestured dismissively toward the piano keys. "Surprise me. Play whatever you think might impress people who are accustomed to hearing the world's finest musicians." Marcus flexed his fingers briefly, the kind of warm-up movement that any serious pianist would recognize as professional preparation for performance. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment as if centering himself for what was about to come, and then began to play. The first notes that emerged from the Steinway were so unexpected, so impossibly beautiful and technically perfect, that the entire dining room fell into complete and immediate silence. Marcus wasn't just playing the piano, he was commanding it with the kind of authority and artistic maturity that spoke to years of serious study with world-class instructors and countless hours of practice developing both technical skill and interpretive sophistication. The piece he had chosen was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Op. 23, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex compositions in the classical piano repertoire. It was a piece that required not only extraordinary finger dexterity and precise timing, but also deep understanding of musical structure, harmonic progression, and the kind of artistic maturity that allowed a performer to tell a coherent musical story across 15 minutes of continuously evolving themes and variations. The music began softly, almost tentatively, with a simple melody that seemed to emerge from the piano like a whispered confidence. But gradually, as Marcus's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence and complexity, the composition began to reveal its true nature. a musical narrative that moved through themes of longing, hope, struggle, triumph, despair, and ultimate transcendence. Richard felt his confident smile disappear entirely as he realized that what he was witnessing wasn't just competent piano playing, but artistry of a caliber that rivaled the professional musicians he regularly hired for private performances at his various homes and corporate events. Marcus's technique was not only flawless, but also completely natural, as if the complex passages and demanding technical requirements of the Chopin Ballade were well within his normal capabilities, rather than at the very edge of what he could manage. More importantly, Marcus's interpretation of the music demonstrated a depth of understanding and emotional sophistication that spoke to extensive musical education and natural sensitivity to the expressive possibilities of classical composition. This wasn't someone who had learned to play piano as a hobby or social accomplishment. This was someone who understood music as a language and was using that language to communicate ideas and emotions that transcended ordinary speech. The Chopin Ballade was structured as a musical story, moving through distinct sections that each contributed to an overarching narrative arc. Marcus played it as if he were narrating a novel, allowing each section to flow seamlessly into the next, while maintaining the dramatic tension and emotional coherence that made the composition so compelling to audiences who understood classical music. His hands seemed to dance across the keys with the kind of fluid precision that made even the most technically challenging passages appear effortless. Rapid scales flowed like water, complex chord progressions rang out with perfect clarity and balance, and the dynamic contrasts between soft, introspective passages and moments of thunderous emotional intensity created an emotional landscape that held every person in the dining room completely transfixed. As the music progressed, Richard became aware that every person in the dining room was completely absorbed in Marcus's performance. Conversations had ceased entirely, champagne glasses remained untouched on tables, and the usual subtle movements of wealthy people checking their phones or whispering to companions had stopped completely. The atmosphere in the room had been transformed from one of casual socializing and networking to something approaching religious reverence for the musical experience they were witnessing. Richard found himself studying Marcus's face as he played, seeing an expression of intense concentration mixed with something that looked like joy or perhaps relief, as if this public performance was allowing him to express parts of himself that remained carefully hidden during his daily work as a restaurant server. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat unsettling. The deferential young man who had apologized for brushing against Richard's jacket had been replaced by an artist whose presence and musical authority commanded the attention and respect of every person in the room. The technical demands of the Chopin Ballade were extraordinary, requiring the pianist to execute rapid passages of incredible complexity while maintaining perfect timing, dynamic control, and emotional coherence throughout the 15-minute composition. Marcus navigated these challenges with the ease and confidence of someone for whom such technical mastery had become second nature, allowing him to focus on the musical storytelling and emotional communication rather than simply surviving the mechanical demands of performance. As the piece approached its most technically demanding section, a passage that required lightning-fast octave runs combined with complex polyrhythmic patterns, Marcus's playing became increasingly passionate and powerful. His hands moved across the keyboard with breathtaking speed and precision, producing cascades of notes that seemed to pour from the piano like water flowing over a magnificent waterfall. The volume and intensity of the music filled the dining room with sound that was both overwhelming and beautiful, creating an emotional experience that left many of the guests visibly moved and some quietly weeping from the sheer beauty of what they were hearing. Richard realized that his mouth was hanging open and that he was staring at Marcus with an expression of complete shock and growing comprehension of how fundamentally he had misjudged not only this young man, but probably countless other people whose abilities and potential he had dismissed based on their circumstances rather than their actual capabilities. Everything he thought he knew about talent, about worth, about the natural distribution of abilities and opportunities in human society was being challenged by the reality of what he was witnessing. Here was someone he had categorized as fundamentally limited by his social class and economic circumstances, someone he had assumed lacked the education, breeding, and natural gifts necessary for genuine excellence, demonstrating artistry that exceeded what Richard had heard from most professional musicians. The realization was deeply uncomfortable because it suggested that Richard's entire worldview, his beliefs about why some people succeeded while others served, his assumptions about natural hierarchies and deserved privileges, might be based on incomplete information and unconscious prejudices rather than objective assessment of human potential and achievement. The final section of the ballade required Marcus to demonstrate not just technical skill but also artistic maturity and interpretive wisdom, bringing the complex musical narrative to a satisfying conclusion that would leave his audience emotionally fulfilled rather than simply impressed by virtuosic display. This was the most challenging aspect of performing Romantic-era compositions, the ability to balance technical excellence with genuine emotional communication and musical storytelling. Marcus accomplished this synthesis with a sensitivity and artistic maturity that suggested not only extensive formal training, but also genuine understanding of the music's emotional and intellectual content. The final passages of the ballade built to a climactic moment of triumph and resolution, then gradually faded into a conclusion that felt both inevitable and surprising, as if Marcus had guided his listeners through a complete emotional journey that left them changed by the experience. As the last notes faded into silence, the dining room remained completely quiet for several long seconds, as if the guests needed time to process what they had just experienced and to transition from the world Marcus had created through his music back to the reality of their social gathering and charitable fundraising event. Then slowly, applause began to build. First from a few individuals who were still too stunned to respond immediately, then spreading throughout the room until it became a thunderous ovation that continued for several minutes. Several guests rose to their feet, and soon the entire dining room was giving Marcus a standing ovation that rivaled what professional musicians received at Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center. Marcus stood up from the piano bench and faced the audience, his expression modest and somewhat surprised, despite the extraordinary demonstration of talent and artistry he had just provided. The transformation back to the deferential restaurant employee was subtle but noticeable. He had allowed himself to be fully present as an artist during the performance, but now he was beginning to return to the professional persona required for his day job. Richard found himself applauding along with his guests, but his mind was racing with questions and realizations that were fundamentally altering his understanding not only of Marcus, but of his own assumptions about human potential and the relationship between circumstances and capabilities. This wasn't just a waiter who happened to have some musical training as a hobby or side interest. This was a serious musician whose technical skill and artistic sensitivity were at a professional level that commanded respect from anyone who understood classical music. The performance Richard had just witnessed would have been impressive, coming from a soloist at a major symphony orchestra or a featured performer at an elite music festival. As the applause began to subside, Richard approached Marcus with an expression that combined amazement with embarrassment about his earlier assumptions and behavior. The confident superiority he had displayed just 20 minutes earlier had been completely replaced by genuine curiosity and a growing sense that he had seriously misjudged the situation. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice lacking the condescending tone he had used during their previous interactions. That was absolutely extraordinary. I've heard professional musicians who couldn't play Chopin with that level of technical skill and artistic interpretation. Where did you learn to play like that? Marcus smiled, but there was something sad and perhaps slightly bitter in his expression that suggested complicated feelings about being asked to explain his abilities to someone who had clearly and publicly underestimated him based on his current employment situation. I graduated from the Juilliard School 3 years ago, Marcus said simply, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who was used to surprising people with this information. Master of Music degree in piano performance, with additional coursework in composition and music theory. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow to his chest. The Juilliard School was arguably the most prestigious music conservatory in the world, accepting only the most gifted students from around the globe and providing training that prepared musicians for careers as international soloists, principal players in major orchestras, and faculty members at leading universities. Admission to Juilliard was extraordinarily competitive, and completing a master's degree program there represented years of intensive study with world-renowned instructors and demonstrated a level of talent and dedication that fewer than 1% of serious musicians ever achieved. "But you're working as a waiter," Richard said, his confusion obvious in his voice and his expression. The disconnect between Marcus's extraordinary qualifications and his current employment seemed impossible to reconcile with Richard's understanding of how talent and success were supposed to correlate in a merit-based society. Marcus's smile became even more complex, mixing sadness with what might have been frustration or resignation about questions he had probably answered many times before. "Classical music performance is an incredibly difficult career path, Mr. Blackstone. There are very few full-time positions available anywhere in the world, and the competition for those positions is beyond what most people can imagine. Most of us who graduate from conservatories work multiple jobs while we audition for orchestras, apply for grants and fellowships, and try to build performance careers that might eventually provide sustainable income." The explanation began to illuminate realities about artistic careers that Richard had never considered or understood. In his world of technology entrepreneurship, talent and hard work generally translated directly into financial success and professional recognition. But Marcus was describing an entirely different kind of professional landscape, where even the most extraordinary abilities and extensive training didn't guarantee economic security or career opportunities. "How long have you been working in restaurants?" Richard asked, his voice now carrying genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive judgment that had characterized their earlier interaction. 2.5 years, Marcus replied. "I work here 4 nights a week, and I also teach private piano lessons during the day, accompany vocalists for auditions and recitals, and play wedding ceremonies and corporate events when I can get booked. It's enough to pay rent and buy groceries while I continue auditioning for orchestra positions and applying for performance opportunities." Richard looked around the dining room, where his guests were still buzzing with excitement about the unexpected musical experience they had just witnessed. Several people had approached the piano area and were trying to engage Marcus in conversation, clearly impressed by his talent and curious about his background and training. The contrast between Marcus's extraordinary abilities and his current circumstances was forcing Richard to confront uncomfortable truths about economic inequality, educational privilege, and the ways that social class could limit opportunities even for people with remarkable talents and qualifications. Richard had always assumed that success was primarily a matter of individual merit, that talented, hard-working people naturally rose to positions of wealth and influence, while less capable people settled into supporting roles. But Marcus represented a challenge to that worldview. Here was someone whose talent and education exceeded what most of Richard's wealthy acquaintances possessed in their own fields of expertise, yet who was working as restaurant staff because the economic realities of artistic careers didn't provide the same pathways to financial success that existed in business and technology. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice carrying a sincerity that had been completely absent from their earlier interactions, "I owe you a profound apology. I made assumptions about you that were not only wrong but insulting and cruel. Your talent is remarkable, and I should have treated you with respect, regardless of what job you were doing tonight." Marcus nodded graciously, accepting Richard's apology with the kind of dignity that suggested he had probably encountered similar situations before and had learned to handle them with grace rather than anger or resentment. "I appreciate that, Mr. Blackstone," Marcus said. "And I should mention that I actually recognized you when you walked in tonight. I've been following quantum dynamics work in artificial intelligence applications for music composition and analysis. Some of the research papers your company has published could revolutionize how we understand the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony and structure." This revelation added yet another layer to Richard's growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged Marcus. Not only was Marcus a world-class musician with advanced training from the most prestigious conservatory in America, but he was also intellectually curious and sophisticated enough to understand complex technological concepts and their potential applications to musical analysis and composition. The combination of artistic excellence and technical knowledge suggested someone whose perspective could be valuable in ways that extended far beyond musical performance. Someone who could contribute meaningfully to the kind of interdisciplinary research and development that was becoming increasingly important in Richard's industry. Richard found himself genuinely curious about Marcus's thoughts on the intersection of technology and music, a conversation that would never have occurred if he hadn't been forced to confront his assumptions about talent, worth, and the relationship between circumstances and capabilities. "Would you be interested in discussing that research sometime?" Richard asked, his question motivated by genuine intellectual curiosity rather than social obligation or guilt about his earlier behavior. "I'd love to hear your perspective on how artificial intelligence applications might be developed to support and enhance human musical creativity rather than replacing it." Marcus's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, the first time during their interactions that he had shown unguarded excitement about anything. "I would absolutely love that conversation. There's so much potential for technology to help musicians explore new creative possibilities while preserving and enhancing the emotional and interpretive elements that make live performance irreplaceable by any artificial system." As the evening progressed, Richard found himself engaged in one of the most stimulating and intellectually rewarding conversations he had experienced in months. Marcus possessed not only extraordinary musical talent, but also intellectual depth, creativity, and insights that made him fascinating to talk with about subjects that extended far beyond music into areas of mathematics, cognitive science, and technological innovation. They discussed the parallels between musical composition and software development, both of which required the ability to create complex, elegant structures that achieved specific functional and aesthetic goals. They explored the challenges of balancing artistic integrity with commercial viability, a problem that existed in both the music world and the technology industry. They examined the potential role that artificial intelligence might play in making classical music more accessible to broader audiences, while respecting the traditions and standards that made the art form meaningful to serious practitioners and listeners. Richard realized that in his rush to categorize Marcus as someone whose worth was limited to serving drinks and clearing tables, He had nearly missed the opportunity to connect with someone whose perspective could enrich his own understanding of both technology and human creativity. The conversation was intellectually stimulating in ways that his usual interactions with other wealthy entrepreneurs rarely achieved, partly because Marcus brought a completely different set of experiences, knowledge, and creative sensibilities to their discussion. As the gala concluded and guests began to leave, many of them stopping to compliment Marcus on his performance and to express interest in hearing him play again, Richard made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him at the beginning of the evening. "Marcus," he said, "I have a proposition for you that I hope you'll consider seriously. Quantum Dynamics has been looking for someone to head up a new research initiative exploring the applications of artificial intelligence in creative industries. The position would involve both research and development work, collaboration with artists and musicians, to ensure that our technology serves creative goals rather than replacing human creativity, and potentially some travel to conferences and universities where this kind of interdisciplinary work is being developed." Marcus stared at Richard with an expression of disbelief and growing excitement. "Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity to use both your musical expertise and your intellectual curiosity in ways that might benefit both your career development and our company's research initiatives," Richard replied. "The position would pay significantly more than restaurant work and private music lessons combined, and it would allow you to stay connected to the music world while exploring new frontiers in technology applications to creative fields." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the unexpected turn his evening had taken from what had started as public humiliation to what might represent a complete career transformation. "Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate the offer more than you can possibly imagine," Marcus said, "but I need to ask you something directly. Are you making this offer because you feel guilty about how you treated me earlier tonight, or because you genuinely believe I could contribute meaningfully to your company's work?" Richard considered the question carefully, recognizing that Marcus deserved an honest answer rather than a polite deflection or corporate speak response. "Both," Richard admitted. "I do feel guilty about my behavior tonight, and I should feel guilty. The way I treated you was inappropriate and cruel, and it revealed prejudices and assumptions on my part that I need to examine and address. But more importantly for your career prospects, our conversation tonight has shown me that you possess exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking, creative perspective, and intellectual sophistication that our research team needs to develop technology that serves rather than replaces human creativity." Marcus extended his hand to Richard with a smile that combined gratitude with determination and perhaps a touch of vindication for all the times his talents had been overlooked or underestimated because of his current circumstances. "Then I would be honored to accept your offer, Mr. Blackstone." 18 months later, Richard sat in the audience at Carnegie Hall, watching Marcus Chen perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the New York Philharmonic. Marcus had been selected as the featured soloist for the performance, partly based on his growing reputation as both a performer and a researcher, but also because of the innovative program notes he had written that explained the mathematical and technological concepts underlying the composition's complex harmonic structure and emotional architecture. Marcus's work with quantum dynamics had produced groundbreaking research into artificial intelligence applications that could help musicians analyze and understand complex compositions, while also developing tools that made classical music more accessible to audiences who lacked formal musical training. The collaboration between Marcus's musical expertise and the company's technological capabilities had been so successful that Richard had created an entire new division focused on creative technology applications, with Marcus serving as the director and leading a team of both musicians and software engineers. But perhaps more importantly for Richard personally, his relationship with Marcus had fundamentally changed his approach to evaluating people, recognizing talent, and understanding the complex relationships between circumstances, opportunities, and human potential. He had learned that extraordinary abilities often existed in unexpected places, and that his assumptions about worth and capability had prevented him from seeing the full humanity and potential of people whose current situations were different from his own privileged circumstances. The research division that Marcus now directed had become one of quantum dynamics' most innovative and profitable units, developing applications that were being used by music schools, symphony orchestras, and recording studios around the world. But beyond its commercial success, the division had also created scholarship programs for talented musicians who needed financial support to pursue advanced training, and had established partnerships with conservatories to ensure that classical music education remained accessible to students from diverse economic backgrounds. As Marcus's performance of the Rachmaninoff Concerto reached its climactic finale, Richard found himself thinking about the evening when he had challenged a waiter to play if you can, expecting to witness confirmation of his prejudices about talent, social hierarchies, and natural limitations. Instead, he had discovered that the most remarkable people were often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look past surface appearances and recognize their true capabilities and potential contributions. The piano had indeed roared that night, but it had done more than simply produce beautiful music. It had shattered assumptions, challenged prejudices, opened minds, and created possibilities that neither Richard nor Marcus could have imagined when their interaction began with condescension and mockery and evolved into mutual respect, collaboration, and friendship. Sometimes the most profound changes in our understanding of the world come not from dramatic revelations or carefully planned educational experiences, but from moments when we are forced to confront the limitations of our own perspectives and open ourselves to the extraordinary potential that exists in every person we encounter, regardless of their current circumstances, or the assumptions we might make about their capabilities based on superficial observations. The greatest talents often wear the most humble uniforms, and the most important lessons about human worth and potential are frequently delivered by people we might otherwise overlook or dismiss. Richard had learned that true wisdom lay not in recognizing excellence only when it appeared in expected places, but in remaining open to the possibility that greatness could emerge from anywhere, at any time, in any form, even from a waiter who could make a piano sing with the voice of angels.